Good afternoon. My name is Wilmarie Newton, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will be answering your questions throughout the presentation, so please type them into the chat box. If you have further questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to email me and I will forward them to the appropriate person that can answer them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under professional development. And now I'd like to introduce Jody Goler, Senior Staff Associate for Policy Services at CABE.
Thank you so much, Will Marie. Much appreciated. And thank you all for attending this webinar for us to learn about the various implementation strategies, roadblocks, and success stories regarding the early efforts to implement the Connecticut school climate policy. Before I introduce two very familiar names to Connecticut educators involved in the school climate improvement efforts over the years, Joanne Friedberg and Pat Saccone, I'd like to just share just a brief overview of my engagement with this work. In the immediacy of the tragic Columbine mass shooting in April of 1999, I began my role as principal of a middle school in June. This being the first mass shooting, it was still in the news and of course in the minds of my staff, my students, and my parents and their parents, the students' parents. At that time, there were no bullying laws, and more importantly, there was little, if any, discussion on strategies to improve school climate or any discussion about school climate at all. And at that time, as we were still in the shock of trying to determine what our next step should be, I contacted the Department of Education and was put into contact with Joanne Friedberg, with whom I worked over the summer to plan initiatives and to address bullying and improve school climate. It was the first time Joe and I met at that time, and we've been steady friends ever since. And at that time, on the legislative front, we began to see anti-bullying legislation focused on identifying and punishing bullies with mandated investigation procedures and reporting and punitive requirements. As these laws were enacted and policies developed, those implementing these policies found themselves reacting to bullying complaints only to determine that many of those complaints didn't rise to the level of bullying, but instead other behaviors that needed to be addressed. These reactive measures also took significant amounts of time and resources away from schools, trying to align resources to improve school climate and develop systems and strategies for better engaging students and making schools happier and safer places to learn. So in the 2023 legislative session, after all these years of working with bullying policies and bullying law, the General Assembly took a significant step forward, moving the policy agenda from a reactive due process compliance-driven one to bullying to a proactive approach to develop the building blocks for building school climate. As with so many things related to school climate, I have looked to Joanne Freiberg and Pat Saccone as leaders in this field, and perhaps as importantly, as leaders whose own perspectives have changed over the years as they've worked side by side with those in the field to address identified bullying behaviors and improve school climate. So at this time, I'm pleased to introduce Joanne and Pat, who will introduce the practitioners on our panel. Joanne?
Thank you. I tend to be the louder one, but Pat will have some words to say as well because she is responsible for bringing restorative practices to the state of Connecticut close to 15 years ago. But I just wanted to say briefly, when I was at the department, I answered the bullying complaints that rose to that level, and there was never any state oversight. It was all local. But it became very, very clear almost within the passage of our first anti-bullying law in 2002 that these laws are backwards. you don't create safer places for students and the adults who work with them by chasing a changing definition around bullying. That's just not how it happens. And it took administrators, and the group gathered here today on the panel are all either school or district leaders in one capacity or another, that have experienced this day in and day out, because for some leaders, it took up to 70%, not 17, but 70% of their time just investigating bullying complaints, with, as Jody says, very, very few of them ever rising to the level of being bullies. And the school districts were never obligated to do anything about it unless it was verified as bullying. So this has been sort of a ongoing professional goal of Pat and mine to switch this law, or see it switched and put it on its head, and instead of asking schools to identify bullies and punish them, why can't we hold them accountable for improving their school climate, which is the ultimate remedy for this beast we call bullying, to create safe places where children don't target one another for any kind of hurtful, mean-spirited behavior. So legislators listen to us. And as Jody mentioned, in 2023, the legislature passed a phase-in law that was signed on June 7th of 2023 and required districts by July 1st of 2025 to adopt the Connecticut School Climate Policy. And in that policy, it mentions working restoratively 19 times. So no matter what else is going on, public schools, magnet schools, and charter schools are all required to work restoratively. So I'm going to hand it over to Pat to talk about why restorative practices is in that legislation 19 times, and why schools are importantly and critically now required to work this way.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Um, well, I'll be very brief, but stemming from the legislators that we were able to work with, who were really listening and hoping to finally get it right in Connecticut as well. They highlighted parts of the policy that was written almost, as Joanne said, 10 to 15 years ago, in a comprehensive district that I happened to be leading at the time. And that policy talks about working restoratively, because those very steps to take and strategies to follow are how we can help kids when there are moments of issues that have to be dealt with, harms that have been done and harms that have to be repaired. So much of what I hope we will be talking about today regarding the rudiments and strategies of what this policy enacts and what the policy helps us to do, um, is very much going to be that which sustains this effort in a school district. And I'm so excited to see all the on the ground folks here on the webinar, because really that's where I come from. I'm kind of the on the ground person working for years in these arenas and hoping to bring it to fruition in any school district that I was working with. So very much like Susan and Ted Wachtel, who founded the International Institute for Restorative Practices, who knew through working with at-risk kids that there were things they were doing that worked and things that they were doing that didn't work. And so I hope that as we hear from all the practitioners today, we're going to hear about, impediments to implementing this, but also successes. And a lot of those successes come from folks on the ground, that all the administrators who are doing this work, who know this work, can see in folks that are having success. So I'm hoping, as Jody says, we'll hear from other people's experiences, but we will hear people's successes as well. So Joanne, do you want to?
Are you muted?
Yeah, you're muted, Joanne.
I think it makes some sense to allow each of our panelists briefly to introduce themselves to you. And if they have just like a brief opening statement or two, just to set the stage for who's here, that would be great. So let me begin with Heather Borges. Heather, you want to introduce yourself and your role and your relationship to this work briefly?
My name is Heather Borges, and I am the acting superintendent for the Stratford Public Schools. I've been in this role since 2023. This is my 14th year in Stratford, and I began the restorative practice journey 14 years ago in Stratford with Joanne and Pat. I was a transplant from New Hampshire, so I was already restorative trained because in New Hampshire we had begun that work years back. So I came already trained and I jumped on board, and we have been on a wonderful roller coaster of ups, downs, and learning for the last 14 years.
Fran, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Joanne. My name's Fran Amara. I'm a school climate specialist at Advance in the school climate and mental health department. I just my second year in this role. Prior to that, I was administrator, high school assistant principal, and then middle school principal up in Region 7 in the Northwest corner. And I began my restorative practice journey with a training with Joanne and Pat about 11 years ago. And as our other members will have said and will continue to say, it definitely has been a journey in discovering effective ways to work with not just children but adults as well, which is where a lot of most of the work starts. And I'm really excited to be here and hear from everybody and hopefully help you along on your journey as well. Thanks, Joanne.
Well, how about if we go to Kate Johns Galvin next?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Johns Galvin. I'm currently the principal of programs at Eastbury here in Glastonbury. We have 5 different programs, 4 of which are just for kids with special needs. I've been a special ed teacher for 27 years. In the last 20 years, we've been working on building our Lynx Academy, which is specifically focused on kids who cannot make progress in a comprehensive setting, and they come here for therapeutic interventions and a variety of other interventions, and then our goal is to get them back. So we've been doing restorative here for quite some time. It's kind of our foundation. It's what makes everything work.
Thank you. So Joe, do you want to go next?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joe Macrino. I'm principal of Oswegatchie Elementary School in Waterford, Connecticut. That's southeastern. I am a principal of about 325 kids in my district, but I also am a parent of 2 rascals. Elvis is a sophomore and Coral is a 7th grader. So I have the lens of both a principal and a parent in town. And I bring that up because I began restorative practice work over a decade ago when I was in Clinton as an assistant principal in a pre-K through 3 school. But it's also helped me as a parent as well, help navigating those difficult conversations when we don't see eye to eye at the kitchen table. So long ago, the seed was planted by Joanne and Pat, and it still blooms to this day. And I'm very happy to see that the rest of the world is catching up to the wonderful lessons that we have learned throughout these adventures. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, Kate Lund, it's to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kate Lund, Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction here in Glastonbury. I guess as I'm trying to build off of many of you who've already introduced yourselves, in my district leadership role here in Glastonbury, we have been very intentional in our work to align the school climate law and CABE's policy framework with what we already know to be good and right for students. So my work in this current role, of which I'm in year 3, has allowed us to move forward with our commitment to providing safe, supportive, and inclusive learning environments. We felt the impetus when we designed our new strategic plan. We're in year 3 of that, and that plan called on the work of being restorative. And so, like many of you, that was sort of the impetus for engaging in consultation, partnership, and what has become friendship with both Joanne and Pat. They have helped lead our work here at a district level. I'm proud to say much of what Kate has shared and what she's celebrating at Lynx Academy and in our Eastbury programs, we are seeing take off in our comprehensive schools across the district.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, Teresa, you want to jump in? You're muted there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Teresa Gingrave, principal in Clinton. I'm at Joel Elementary School. This is my 30th year at Joel. I was a principal in Fairfield for a few years before this new journey. And I just really want to formalize a process of our restorative practices work. Last year, we engaged in a year-long training of our staff with Joanne and Pat. We first started with some trauma-informed practices and then trained the whole staff in looking at our systems. And this year, we're really in full implementation, hoping to create much more positive climates in our schools, but also holding kids accountable. But we just know that the work we were doing before just wasn't getting us what we needed. And so working in this way, we're hoping to get to better outcomes. And I think the data is showing, at least the initial data we're starting to track, looks pretty good right now. So I'm really excited to share all this information with all of you and learn from you, and offer some ideas and resources that might advance the work. Good to be here.
Thank you, Teresa. Okay, Michelle and Jay.
Should start with them now.
Yeah, you go ahead. Hey.
Hi, I'm Michelle Williams. I am the Elementary Curriculum Director for Windsor Public Schools. Previously, I was a principal here in Windsor Public Schools, and I started working with Joanne and Pat probably around 10 years ago. So I brought it back to my school at the time. And we started working restoratively, and then I actually started training. I had scheduled for Joanne and Pat to start training other schools within the district, and that was during the pandemic year when things came to a stop in March of 2020. So we were not able to finish our training at that time. And so we are re-embarking on that training now, and I'll let Danielle Batchelder explain that and how we're doing that in Windsor. But I'm excited to be working with Joanne again. We had a lot of great success while I was a principal of starting to implement this and changing mindsets and really working on being more restorative, being more positive with our students, and really working on how we restore our actions towards other people. And I think that was one of the most positive things that we started seeing from our students and within our staff.
Yes, hi, Jay Mihalko, proud principal of Paquonic School. We're a pre-K through 2 school here in Windsor. This is my 5th year here. Prior to that, I had been a principal in Hartford. I'm really excited around this work because at the same time that we are doing this and really getting trained as an administrative staff and select other staff to get this ball rolling here again in Windsor and really creating the roadmap for our shift in school culture. But at the same time, we're also starting our Windsor Way focus. So across the entire district, we're using a common language of in Windsor, students are caring, committed, courageous, and creative, and really having these restorative practices focused on relationship being at the center of our work is bringing even more meaning to those words. I think about when I really got sold on the training that we did recently, we were looking at words such as, what is a restorative approach versus a permissive versus a neglectful versus a punitive approach. And we looked at the descriptions of those different approaches. The restorative is really a description of a school that I would want to lead and I would want my own children going to. And I'm sure we'll speak to that more as we go along, but just really excited to be with such smart people here and to learn from one another and do what's right for our kids.
And last but not least, Danielle, you want to jump in as part of the Windsor team?
Sure, you bet. Hi, I'm Danielle Batchelder. I am the Chief of Operations for Windsor Public Schools. The reason why I am involved in this is because I oversaw and I still oversee all of security and safety in the district. And once this new law came out, it took that school climate and safety law, and then so now we have school safety and we have school climate. So I'm still, spearheading the work for the district at this point. And as soon as I heard restorative practice, I immediately ran to Michelle Williams and said, "Help!" because she really has been doing this work. And so Michelle got me in touch with Joanne and Pat, which has been incredible. And we made it a commitment to do a 4-session PD with all of our administrators well into the evening. It's definitely a big commitment. We have one again tonight from 3 to 8, where we are training our administrators first, figuring out a rollout plan from there to get into all the schools. But while we're doing this, I'm also sending about 50 teachers throughout this school year to the CAS trainings that both Joanne and Pat are hosting, so we can have a lot of representation in each building and start the work that way. And I just want to say that when I watched the still face experiment, and I'm not going to give anything away, but that PD or that video that Joanne and Pat showed us last time, when I saw that one, I was just sold. So I encourage everyone to absolutely look that up. And it just goes back to an infant and a baby with a mother. And it just shows how facial expressions and the connectiveness of someone and people together shape who we are and shape our emotions.
Thank you, Danielle. I think before we start with some general questions and get this conversation going, since Danielle mentioned it, restorative practices is based on a scientific foundation, which is how human beings are hardwired, psychologically as well as physiologically. I will try to, let me just ignore the chat for now. But the point is, if anybody's seen Inside Out or Inside Out 2, that is also, that wonderful animated film is also based on the same science. So this isn't a curriculum, it's not a program, it's a way of thinking and being, and about fundamentally focusing on creating wonderful relationships and community, which is the climate. Because if you don't create them, when there are transgressions, rules broken, harms done, conflicts, and so on, you can't repair them. And we think the best synonym is healing. So what we're really trying to do is create healing practice. And this is what all adults expect. And this is what we want to transform our schools to become. And everybody gathered here today believes that it is working. And that's why we invited them. So, having said that, Jody, I don't know if you want to pose a question and see who wants to jump out at it or whatever.
Sure. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you everybody again for being here and for your great work in this area. But let me just begin again. A little bit of a personal experience is that when I first started working at CABE as the policy associate, I had just finished an 8-year term as a superintendent in a district in Connecticut. And I worked as a superintendent for about 12 years in 3 different districts. And when I first came to CABE, we were preparing for the 2023 legislative session. And one of the conversations I had was with a person looking to propose legislation that would significantly change the bullying law and turn it into a school climate law. And again, having been a principal, an assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, a superintendent, I certainly saw the flaws in the bullying legislation, and I saw the impact it had on our schools, the amount of paperwork, the issues I had with a parent sharing a story about her child being bullied, starting from the bullying report and then determining that it wasn't bullying, and then have to work with the parent on that and with the staff. there are a lot of issues with the previous bullying legislation and policies that stemmed from it, along with the paperwork and the reactive nature of it. But when I heard about the legislative agenda moving towards completely shifting that, one of my concerns was that's a huge change. It's a huge shift. How are districts, how are superintendents, how are staff members, how are parents going to take that shift and learn about it and train for it and implement it effectively? So I wanted to kind of throw that out to you and look at, what was your mindset going into this legislation? What were the shifts you had to make? And how did you make it all work and be early implementers of this new policy?
Which one of you wants to take it? Start it off.
I'm happy to speak to this first, and then Kate Johns-Galvin, my partner here representing Glastonbury, if you want to build off of my response, please, by all means, do so. I think for Glastonbury, it was really important for us to first acknowledge that sort of this idea of discipline reform can't happen without some sort of relationship reform, but also some leadership reform. And so we went into it sort of eyes wide open that there's going to be some natural tension between being restorative and being consequential in your approach, if you will. And so we tried to frame our rollout. And again, now I'm dating myself a little bit here. We started in, I think it was August of 2023 formally, that approaching challenging behaviors through a restorative lens isn't something that's happening instead of, but also in addition to. And so I think that was a way that we framed it initially, Jody, in an effort to make sure that we acknowledged the tension, increased our buy-in, but that was a start for us. The other piece I would just add is that we were clear to communicate to our leadership team as well as our staff that restorative practices really are just an extension of good teaching and an inclusive culture. So we were really able to leverage our strategic goals around creating those safe, supportive, and inclusive learning environments and demonstrating restorative practices as a strategy to that end.
Fran, maybe you could jump in before Kate, just to get a...
Yeah, definitely. And then just building on what Kate just shared, I mean, it really was the mindset, like the belief system around the adults, myself included. My early work as a administrator, as a dean of students, which was really focused on the student life of a high school. And I learned it was very punitive. It was, you're late to class, here's your detention. You skipped the detention, here's your longer detention. Then now we're going to suspend you. We're so upset you're late to school and class, we're going to suspend you from school. So the mindset for myself around, well, that wasn't actually working, looking at the fact that it was the same students over and over again. And then helping the adults in my building shift as well, this like aha moment of, we're doing the same thing over and over again and not getting the outcomes we were looking for. And then looking at it in the bigger picture of it, it's not one or the other. It's just how do we build proactively that 80% of building the community? Where are success stories with families? And they were around doing things with them, not to them or for them. And once we started sharing those stories and looking at problems of practice through a restorative lens, it started to shift the mindset of the adults. The adults were feeling better about their work, and then that shifted into the work we were doing with our students.
Thank you. Kate, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Caitlin was saying was so spot on. We've had this alternative placement, a therapeutic day program here for almost 20 years, and it became very compartmentalized. These students go there. And I've been pretty fortunate because we could cultivate here as much as, in whatever way we wanted. And we never used detentions or traditional discipline here. We always used skill building, restorative practices, relationships. But to then look at, well, where are we trying to get these students back to? It was very hard. It became challenging when they went back to traditional discipline models. And you were catching a whole bunch of kids before you had to look at outplacing. So it was fantastic that the district took this on in an effort to try to keep kids in their homeschool and try to make a transition back to homeschool smooth for our students and our families who found a lot of success. I mean, we went from 2 students almost 20 years ago to we're on track to have about 109 students this year. But in the last 3 years, we've gotten 19 students back to their home schools. So I think that piece of having the home schools also able to be restorative and allow for students to continue to grow was really important for I know for us and our families.
Jody, do you want to pose another question? I mean, we can keep going this one or.
Again, I do have just maybe one other question. Again, this might be a little bit more on the technical side of things, but when developing policy, I often look toward what are the unintended consequences of a policy. And I know, having spoken with other superintendents who are hitting some roadblocks in the area of the challenging behavior form and the number of how do you identify? So the questions range from if everything is a challenging behavior, we have this form, do we get overburdened with forms that we have to deal with, even though it's not bullying anymore, now it's about challenging behavior. So are there things that you're doing or the way you proceed with your work that get away from or deal with addressing the reporting of challenging behavior so you can investigate it and take the right course of action and follow the policy? It seems like some districts may be overburdened with the forms and dealing with the forms. So how do you reconcile that in your work?
Jody, before we let the panelists take this, I just want to mention that was filtered through the Connecticut State Collaborative on Social Emotional Learning and School Climate. And it is a form that was, we know how policies are made. Sometimes it becomes sausage, if you will, but it is not required. And so there's another form called the incident reporting form. One of the problems that we've always had with forms is that we label a conclusion before it's been investigated. And so unfortunately, this form that is not required kind of took us backwards. So for anybody out there, and whether it's Board of Ed members or district leaders, that is an optional form. And I believe, don't you have some other options now, Jody, the incident reporting form on your website?
We do. Yes, we do. As part of the appendices with the school climate policy, we do have an incident reporting form, which is much easier to fill out. I guess even with that, though, if you look at every single challenging behavior in your school as another form you have to fill out, that becomes a very paper-laden process where you're just reacting to forms and dealing with forms all day long. So again, I think it has to do with how do you interpret the policy in regard to reporting challenging behavior, and how do you ensure that you're getting the reports necessary without getting overburdened with paper and filling out forms all day long.
If I could,
Joe wanted to step in.
I just wanted to bring up, even before we get to forms, I'd refer back to my old pal Ross Green when I first started as an assistant principal, and the discussion about lagging skills. And so my question going into this role, starting at a new school, is what do we do before the forms and before the bullying investigations? And I took the lagging skills literally and transferred it over into our SRBI process. So in addition to academic SRBI team, we have a behavioral SRBI team. So we can truly look at these what eventually could become troubling behaviors as part of the learning process, or a child missing an important piece of executive function skills or routine or something like that. And by starting there, even before the restorative practice end of things, by starting with this child is struggling, where are the strengths and where are the struggles, and then pursuing tiered intervention on the behavior spot, had really helped us out in terms of, first of all, being accountable as adults, like having the receipts when push comes to shove and you need a record of what you did. Definitely not the pound of flesh that some people were looking for, but We have the data collection. We have noted interventions that we've tried and what's worked until we've exhausted those and get to the next tier so the child could get the support that they needed. And then what we were finding is a lot of the most effective strategies that we were putting in place after repeated behaviors had a name, which was restorative practices. So we really did the legwork first of establishing a routine of these are behaviors. Behaviors are a response to stimuli, and slowly, almost through osmosis, working that in to our meetings. All right, I know you're having trouble with this child, but let's talk about what they can do and what they cannot do, and approach it as if the child was having difficulty reading. And that was a great springboard for us to then start implementing a more restorative approach.
So Heather, you want to go next, and then Jay and Michelle, you can follow.
Yep, let me figure out how to lower my hand. There we go. So the forms, Jody, that's a great jumping off point because it does muddy up the work you want to do, but the forms are important. We did end up using the ones you have on CAVE for the Stratford Public Schools. And I think what is key is making sure that you work with your technology department to leverage technology to make the collection of these forms more manageable and streamlined. So in the Stratford Public Schools, we literally turned it into a form. We have a platform for the Stratford Public Schools that collects every form we use. And so when someone fills that out, it immediately funnels to the person who needs to have it and generates an automatic response letting that person know we have received it and that the investigation will begin. So because we have this automated system, it's streamlined our responses. Then everybody in each school knows. So, and how you do that is we take your CAVE form, we created a technological digital version of it, and the first drop down identifies the school that you are reporting this for, right? And so then that's going to funnel to the appropriate person at that school, allowing us to be more responsive and be able to complete things quicker. In addition, when the administrator is done completing their investigation, we have also made that electronic so that those responses can go back to the person who filed that complaint in the first place. So because we have leveraged AI and digital technology, and our director of instructional technology has taken those things, we've been able to streamline it. But again, before you get to a form, I really agree with Joe that it's the teaching first, right? So there's so many other layers that go with this restorative. In Stratford, we use DESA as a way to do an assessment for social and emotional learning for all of our students and make sure we're teaching those skills in the first place. But to answer your specific form question, you just got to have a system in place.
Okay, thanks, Heather.
So, I mean, I can speak towards the elementary school, and so we've been doing work again as administrators around restorative, but the two things that come up the most are around accountability and time, right? So, are we still holding kids accountable for using restorative, and then how much time is it going to take to do this whole new program, right? But restorative is not a program, right? It's not a form. It's a way of thinking. It's the way you approach things. And so I think some of it is the butting the head of things that have been encapsulated in handbooks and policies that is tough for us to sometimes get away from, because a form makes things very simple, right? Okay, this person said this, now I fill out this form, and now I follow this process, but you're still almost heading down like a punitive path. And what it's more about is about the relationships with our students. And so one of the things we talk about for accountability is, a student, if they do something in the cafeteria, right, they would much rather, sorry, announcements coming in. They would much rather, have a punishment, to like miss recess, right? Or you can't miss recess, so then I'll take that one back. But have to lose something rather than actually having to correct the situation by speaking to the custodian. How do we heal and make our community complete? And so really we have been purposeful in Windsor, and Danielle and Michelle can speak to it. And again, we're just building out the roadmap at the same time, but trying to keep it as simple as possible. So we already have a lot of structures in place through Power School where you do your contact log with the parents. There's where some of the conversations can be captured, right? It's not necessarily a discipline log. It's about a conversation with the family about the steps we took with the student. The one lift that we did add was for the tiered responses, right? Which was one of the mandates that after the first incident, you need to contact all the parents of the students who were impacted. The next time you have to have the meeting with the parents. So we kept our same documenting structure through Power School for the logs. We just added a box where was this a tier 1 or a tier 2 or a tier 3. So we didn't add in an additional form. We used what we already have, but we are just earmarking them whether it's a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And from the state perspective, it's not the tiers that we talk about in terms of intervention, but was this, the first time that we addressed something, or is it the second or third?
And to piggyback off what Jay is saying, so we spent time as administrators this summer reviewing the tier 1 and the tier 2 and the tier 3 responses and so let me piggyback. So after I left the building as a principal, I had the opportunity to go into all of the buildings and find that people ran things differently, including how they disciplined children and how they responded to children, if they were restorative or not restorative. But I feel like when we spent this time this past summer about our tiered responses, that put the schools back on the same playing field, right? So everybody had that conversation, and this is how we are going to respond and the behaviors that we are responding to. So I feel like, so before I used to see the same behavior at the middle school may have received a harsher consequence than a behavior at the high school. And so I'm like, wait, we're not on the same page here. And even within the high school, we had administrators giving out different types of consequences for behaviors. So now that we've had these conversations about tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 responses, everyone is more on the same playing field as far as how they're responding to certain behaviors and then how they're reacting and how they're restoring those behaviors as well.
Thank you for that. Fran?
Yeah, thank you, Jody. In my new role now, a lot of my work is helping districts and schools with the implementation of this policy. And this piece about the forms is a frequently asked question and discussion we have. And we always bring it back to behavior response system. And this is what a lot of our panelists have just talked about over the last few minutes. What is your current behavior response system when you see types of challenging behavior? And what a lot of our schools have found is they needed work in this. They needed to really start from the ground up and start by identifying what are challenging behaviors we're seeing, both as administrators, but then bringing it into their schools with their teachers. So, and what they're learning is the same behavior might happen, and I may see that as like a really low level behavior as a teacher that I will handle in the classroom. But maybe, Jody sees it as something more extreme that needs administrative support. So really calibrating, looking at our current behavior response system. Does that current system align with the policy, and what changes need to be done? And the big piece with the form, the challenge and behavior reporting form that we talk about, is your public facing form. So all stakeholders, parents, students, and staff have the ability to report challenging behavior in a clear way that you're going to investigate it and then come follow up after. I think that maybe have been lacking in some schools and some districts, was that follow up of closing the loop of to the reporter about that there was some type of intervention that was made.
Thank you, Fran. Before I go to Danielle, I just wanted to ask you around that as well. Did you have any issues around defining challenging behavior and what kind of challenging behavior should be reported? What should be reported? To get to that grain size in your conversations with staff?
Yeah, I mean that's a real common conversation we're having, and helping principals facilitate those learning and opportunities with their staff around what that is, and understanding how we can do that in a restorative way. And what I've learned through these other districts is doing it with the teachers in a restorative way to help build an understanding and capacity together is allowing them more effectively to address those challenging behaviors, where it's not just punitive and it's the same things over and over again.
Right. Good. Thanks, Fran. Danielle?
So I actually was going to answer, someone added a question in the chat regarding the Board of Ed side of it and policy. Or I can wait on that. It's up to you.
No, go ahead. I
Okay.
just saw that come up as well, and I think that's a great question. So if you can,
Yeah.
you can take that.
So we are actually bringing it to our board tomorrow night. And we did a subcommittee of policy, but from the time that the invitation and meeting minutes for the board agendas went out to pretty much last night, we've been getting emails from board members asking about, what is this? Does that mean we're not calling police anymore? Does that mean we're not disciplining anymore? So it is, what makes this nice is it's law, first of all, so we're doing it. But there is a definite professional development that needs to happen in conjunction with board members as well as families. And I know Joanne and Pat have taught us in Windsor, once we start that ball rolling, we have got to get families on board so they truly understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and that it's not about, not being punitive. It's just about learning and being restorative in that approach. So, I see, we'll see tomorrow how it, goes with our board, but I do know that it will be a discussion and there will be board members that feel that they don't like this new approach. So there's a big learning curve, I think, that districts have to get through to the Board of Ed and to families as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Again, I think the question too points to people perceiving there are really two different buckets we deal with. One is the soft emotional side of things, and the other is holding kids accountable. So if it's early on, I would hear things from superintendents and board members that, so what, we don't do anything with bullies anymore? We just allow them to just come to our school and bully kids, and we're just going to facilitate circles with kids who are doing horrible things in schools. So there's really, I think in some ways, a misunderstanding of, or an identification of different buckets of approaches to behaviors. And I think people are trying to reconcile all of that as well. And I see that in that kind of a question. But let's stay on this. I think it's really important. People do wonder about this. So go to Kate.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I caught that question and appreciated Danielle's response in your anticipation of a board meeting tonight, right? You always try to be as prepared as you can and anticipate what the questions may be. From a standpoint here in Glastonbury, I'll offer some of the things that we have done in effort to communicate the very reality of restorative practices to sort of combat maybe the misnomer that they are in many ways, and also invite parents in for school-based sessions for learning. So I know we're about 3 years into our journey here. So for other districts, you may be in the earlier stages, but something that we did just last summer, after we had moved towards policy, we created a page on our public-facing website under teaching and learning that attempted to educate any consumer about restorative practices in Glastonbury Public Schools. We leveraged the restorative practices scouts, right? So those administrators, those educators, inclusive of classroom teachers and related service providers, to provide some testimonials. We got into classrooms to sort of see what the 80% looked like, but then also provided some tangible examples of what restorative practices may be when being used to address challenging behavior. We included sort of a high-level overview, a basic interpretation and understanding in our community-wide mailer that went home to all households in our first year. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're in year 2 officially here with training, but we've hosted our first community event in the evening. We did this at one of our elementary schools just 2 weeks ago, where Joanne and Pat were actually partners in helping to educate members of the PTO and any other parent from that community to come in and understand what restorative practices are at the school level, but then what are those restorative questions? What are those strategies, as Joe spoke to earlier with your parent hat on, that you can turnkey in your household so that your children are hearing the same kinds of messaging and common terms that that we're using in the classroom and in our schools. So more than happy to share some of the resources that we've put together and distributed across our community if helpful. But the education piece takes a tremendous amount of time. So I appreciate where you're at with that.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I see that Joanne is dutifully making reference to some of these resources as well in the chat. So thank you, Joanne, for doing that. Teresa?
Yes, I was just going to add, I think engaging that parent community is critical for the success of the work in schools. I think when you can show a parent that working restoratively is keeping kids accountable. I think, in the former set of beliefs is that what is a punishment? What are you going to do? And I think when we can express to parents that, you sat down with children, you investigated, you brought kids together, always ask permission. I'd like to bring the kids together to work things out and to fix something. Takes a lot on a student to be able to fix the harm that was done to their community. I think when parents are involved in that process, we're going to see a lot more success. Just it's a mind shift not only for the staff, but I think also for the parent community to understand that there is high accountability with this process. That we have high expectations for kids, but we also are providing high supports, and it takes time. I think that's one of the things that my staff is seeing is, wow, it's a lot of work to work this way. But I think what they're seeing is we're turning the corner on improving, and those lagging skills that Joe talked about that we've been, working on. And there's, all kinds of behavior. There's annoying, there's challenging behavior. What is it? Because, in elementary school, there's a lot of annoying behaviors. And so we have to define all that carefully. But I think once you start working in this manner, all staff engaging the parents, and sometimes it's a case by case, sometimes it's one parent at a time. I think we start to see the long-term effects of this work. And I think it's just staying the course. We have seen a lot of success already in a short amount of time that we have worked in this way. And it's very hopeful for us.
Thanks, Teresa. Let's go to Heather and then Joe.
My hand won't go down. Hold on one second. So in Stratford, we also had some different groups of people that were pushing back against SEL and assessment of students in SEL. And really it's about the approach that you do in order to change people's minds. So one thing everybody agreed on is our portrait of a graduate. Those attributes within the portrait of a graduate are in direct relationship to restorative practice and the expectations in restorative practice. So for us to get our students to achieve that portrait of a graduate, we need to do this teaching and this assessing. And so we've been on this journey for 14 years, but throughout this time, we have been able to really bring everybody in by saying, these are the most important things that they're out to teach. We have even more leverage for that now, because really it's truly the most important skills all of our students need are what we are envisioning to be a good citizen, a collaborator, a communicator, a lifelong learner. And so when you tie that to restorative practice, which really is about respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration, it is each of those skills within that portrait of a graduate. So when you have those board members push back, remind them of what you are trying to bring your students to, and that this is a vital part of that teaching. We're not saying restorative practice is going to completely replace consequence. It deepens accountability. We changed our language, right? So it's about the accountability. It's not about the consequence. And so when you approach it that way, I do think the people that are most resistant do eventually come around, because nobody's arguing that that portrait of a graduate is wrong. They all want the students to reach that. So tie it in and use it usefully.
Yeah, I love the nod towards coherence and the idea of looking at your entire district, looking at your policies, looking at the aspirational documents of your district, and embedding this work in that. That's very powerful. Thanks, Heather. Joe?
When we have a situation at school, I don't think I've ever called up a parent and say, "Hey, I just want to let you know your son got punched in the stomach, so we're going to use restorative practices and everything's going to be okay." Like it doesn't work that way. I realized early on, as passionate as I was about restorative practices, my vocabulary or the word choice I use when I explain what we're doing to follow up was extremely important. And luckily, I got to try it out early on with some difficult parents who so basically it's really hard to go against calling up somebody and saying your child got punched in the stomach, so I'm going to give them an opportunity to have a voice and I'm going to help them advocate for themselves. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, they're going to check in with me and the other student that was the offender, and we're going to make sure that over the span of time they build a relationship and restore that relationship. I mean, you got to put, as Joanne has taught me time and time again, you got to put the time in. And yeah, everybody is not everybody. There's still going to be a constituency of people who want the pound of flesh, even for a kindergartner. And in going to a war of titles, you know, restorative practices or putting this is not going to get you to it. It's actually explaining the process. The process is what's important. And once you get beyond the label and they understand the process, that you're giving people, including adults, I use this with adults in my school, you're giving them a chance to let people know how they were harmed, and as a team you come up how to fix it. And I haven't had parent pushback against that when you put it in those terms. They're still going to ride that bullying term for a long time. That's still effervescent on social media, and they're hot on that. You know, they want to make sure their child's not bullied. I would rather hear that my child was taught to advocate for themselves, because I think the long-reaching investment in that will have a greater payoff.
That's great, Joe. And again, I think sometimes we as educators use terminology without really explaining the terminology, so it leaves people to create their own definitions or understandings or use their own background to fill out what we don't fill in for them around the actual work we do and what it all means. So thank you for that. Kate?
Yeah, I was just reading in the chat a question about, you know, somebody who had attended the TBTP in Hartford on Friday and checking in on students after they've been, you know, reported as what was called a bully or had an incident. And I just, having worked with the kids who typically have been identified in their school settings as a bully or having had pretty big challenging behaviors, I think what's sometimes lost is that those kids actually need a bunch of attention, skill building, relationships, and to feel successful. So yes, I've seen when you pour into those kids and help them understand their impact and develop their skills so that they can interact and get their needs met in a more socially appropriate way, they go on to do really great things, and the harm to others does stop. So you know, when talking with parents, when talking with my other school leaders here in Glastonbury, the focus is less on how did you discipline them and more on, well, how did you teach them? How did you uncover what their needs are and how to get those needs met in a more socially appropriate way so that they themselves have long-term growth and success?
Overall, the school climate committee too can play a really important role in fulfilling that role of after action, even though it's a little bit more, probably a little broader. You're able to look to see how your systems are aligned with the kinds of behaviors you're addressing and the outcomes of the way you're addressing them. So you're really looking at real data, you're looking at real information, real circumstances that occur in your school, real things that you're addressing. And you're able to look at all of that in a real way with people who are on this committee to address this and to develop a school improvement plan or a school climate improvement plan around the data you're collecting to bring that forward as well. You know, we actually in revising our school safety policy have included after action as part of that process. But I really believe it's probably, just having been a superintendent and participated in those after action um, um, meetings with police and other safety personnel. It really did give me an opportunity to really think looking forward. So you have to look back to see what occurred and how you used the process you had and what the outcomes were to help develop the plan moving forward. And I like the idea of the school climate committee and the school climate improvement plan as a vehicle for taking, continuing growth in these areas. So thank you, Kate, for that. Joanne?
I just want to mention very briefly and then turn it back to all of our questions that I think because of whether it's social media or the media and the plethora of guns in this country, that the constituents are petrified of school shootings. And what we know about the school shooters who have been members of their own community is they were totally disconnected from their community. They didn't feel they belonged. They didn't have adults they could go to. They were horribly treated, and we could go on and on. And if you can know the kids really well, you can look for the nascent beginnings of kids who desperately need connection. So we can, go through one lockdown after another, and that's not really going to change. I'm not in any way suggesting we shouldn't do that, but it doesn't change the circumstances of the very kids who are suffering that don't know what to do other than to totally lash out. So this is really primary prevention in knowing these kids and making sure that everyone feels they matter and that they have a place and that they belong and so on. So this is really the good work that must happen so we don't really have to focus our attention on the horrific kinds of things.
Thank you, Joanne. Danielle?
Yes, thank you. So I actually attended that symposium on Friday with our director of security and sat in a 2-hour session with a father that his little boy got shot and killed from Parkland High School. And the whole time I was sitting there, it was just gut wrenching. I kept thinking about Joanne and Pat and the work we're doing and thinking, because what we see on the news isn't always accurate. And he pointed that out. The number of people that knew about this individual that killed these kids from kindergarten through grade 12 was astonishing to me. How many adults within the school system labeled him, like they would call him the crazy boy, but no one did anything. And it was like, I just kept thinking of like, how does this happen? So, and I just kept thinking like, thank God something changed finally. And we have to do the restorative work. We have to do the school climate, because what we were doing wasn't working, because kids were absolutely falling through the cracks, and district leaders, district teachers, everyone just allowed it to go through. And it was very impactful hearing it from an actual father about how many teachers, administrators allowed that one student to get through, when no one to just say like, let's get to know you.
So thank you, Danielle. And looking at such an horrible thing. There are certain events in our lives that change our perspective and open our eyes to a different way of doing something. I'm just curious with all of you. There must have been something that took you from believing in one approach to considering this new approach or this other approach. What were some of those things that changed your mind around what you were doing to what you are now doing? Teresa?
Well, I would say, I think, when you look at our previous approaches where, you suspend a child, you have some punitive measure. We just did not see the long-term rewards, right? I think when kids can understand impact, their impact to others, when you get kids in a room figuring out what harm was done and working to fix it. There's transformation in that. There's this power in that. And I think in the situations we've been involved in, where we got, parents to talk to one another, we got kids to talk to one another, we got kids who may have, destroyed a classroom, provide some measure of giving back and understanding the impact on their community. I think, that's transformational with human beings, right? When they see the impact and the harm that might have been done to their community, their beloved community, of their classroom, of their school, and what it takes to fix that, I think it's forming humans. I mean, we know there are adults today who can't even function in that manner, and we're trying to get little kids to understand that, and to give back, and to empathize and with compassion. I just see that as great work and worthwhile work to continue doing.
Thank you, Teresa. Heather?
I think what really brought Stratford along was the desire to be proactive instead of reactive. So discipline is reactive. I'm giving you a consequence to something that you did. And what restorative practice allows is for us to approach this in a proactive way. So data-driven threat assessment and restorative accountability, they can work together for us to be able to make sure that we are providing the supports for students. And we try to say it's not just follow up, it's follow through. So we don't just follow up with students after incidents happen. We follow through with what they need in order to make sure they are restoring and not having that incident happen again. So it's really just about those perceptions and trying to make sure everything works together.
Thank you, Heather. Joe?
I bought in completely a couple of years ago when I had a kid who was constantly or routinely messing up in the cafeteria and in the bathroom, just making a mess everywhere they went. And we had a restorative conversation with our custodian. And luckily, he had pictures of his family in his office. So instead of making the kid get on his hands and knees and clean it all up, I brought him down to Fred's office and I said, we're going to have a conversation, guys, right now. And we talked about this is Fred's family. This is Fred's schedule. And as a result of what you did, Fred's not going to be home in time for dinner tonight with his kids. So putting the relationship end of it onto it was important. And they became best friends. I had to keep the kid away from Fred's office because he was going down there so much. We really restored a relationship there. They became friends. And similarly, the proof is in the pudding. Last week, I have a very spicy second grade cohort. All right. So they're very handsy out on the playground. So I had 3 pairs of students lined up at my door last Friday, chomping at the bit for a PPT to be over to come in and let me know what a great recess they had together. And they bought in. And I go back to Ross Green again. Kids can do well when they can, or kids will do well when they can do well. And restorative practice, that follow-up or that follow-through also provides the opportunity for the children themselves to celebrate that they got through this and now that they have a new friend. It's one of the greatest things because there's a intrinsic reward at the end of this. A friend. If the restorative practice works, particularly for playground stuff, I'm not talking about the huge stuff, you're going to earn another friend out of it. So you can't go wrong with it, especially for the little ones.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's great. Thank you. Joanne, I know you're reading these comments. There was one that had to do with resources beyond this conversation, places where people can go to ask and get answers to practical questions.
Sure. Let me just say that we can put in the chat our email addresses so that anybody can reach out to us. I was just about ready to answer this last question about restorative justice, uh, this work originally came out of criminal justice and it came out of counseling. But it's been in the last, there's quite a few decades that schools are starting to embrace this. And we only refer to it as restorative practices. In fact, in the policy, it always says restorative practices. It doesn't say restorative justice. Although, again, there's history with that, and our juvenile review boards are working restoratively, and more criminal courts and so on are moving in this direction because the data around recidivism is incredibly profound. Why would you not want to work restoratively? Let me just mention also in terms of resources, we have our website is we just keep posting stuff up there on resources. The document that Kate referred to is posted up there, but everybody sends us things and we just keep posting it because we want people to be successful with this work. Fran Amera had to jump off, but when he was administrator at Northwestern Regional High School, after they completely jumped on the bandwagon, wow, I want to say 2011-12, they came into the training. This is just one piece of data. We have an awful lot. They came into the training with 23.7% chronic absenteeism. They went back and transformed their North Star, that this was going to be the most important thing they did: community building, relationship creation, and so on. So really focusing on the climate and holding kids accountable when there were issues and so on. But by transforming how they did business within a very short period of time, a year or two, that chronic absenteeism dropped from 23.7% to 3.1%. And after that happened, the state actually came in and gave them an award of a high school of distinction for academics because the kids were now there. They wanted to be there and so on. So this isn't really academic. This is about transforming how you do business. And we invited administrators here today in creating or crafting this webinar that really understand the power of this work. Not to say that there aren't people, as Joe said earlier, who aren't on board yet, but the train has left the station. And it's really the right thing for kids. It's the ethical thing for kids and adults who work with them. Now it's the legal thing that we have to do. So I could talk forever, but we'll put our email addresses in the chat so everybody can find us after if they have more questions.
I'll also say that from a K policy perspective, if there are things that Joanne, tools that she has or other things that will help implement this policy, I'll certainly make sure that they end up in the appendices of this school climate policy as well. So that will be we'll continue to refresh and add to our resources on our side. Pat, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the extent that Joanne is talking about the folks that are on this webinar, I would say that everyone here is an incredible resource as well at varying stages along their journey of implementation. So I think that folks who are writing in, watching the webinar or watch it after the fact could also consider the folks that are on this as a good resource to talk about some specific problems that may be aligned with similar districts and so on.
Thank you for that, Pat. Just a couple of things in the chat I just wanted to throw out there, see if anybody had a response to. One is a statement. It would be nice if the ED 166 discipline report included restorative practices in addition to restorative justice as an option. Anybody want to take that?
I think we all agree.
We all.
It just isn't there yet. But I will say that many districts are adding a place in Power School that does track this. I see Caitlin shaking her head, and Teresa is too, so that there is documentation. And I love what Heather said about follow through. This is not about, quick deal. A restorative conversation could take 10 minutes, but that's 10 minutes of time where something ends as opposed to, and, when Joe talks about having that spicy kid meet with Fred, the custodian, not only did it end, but that conversation, it probably didn't take that long. But for all of those times in the cafeteria and outside in the bathrooms and so on, how much time is wasted there? So I think we have to look at this very, very differently because the investment, a true believer in this work, a true leader, we've never had anybody say, yeah, I'm going back to the old way. They say, no way ever. This is just how we operate.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne. Another question that came up in the chat. It says, why do you suppose it took so long for schools to adopt something like this? During my first term as a Board of Ed member, I continue to hear about bullying and how nothing is done. Lastly, what is the statute of limitation on bullying for a student that was targeted for a whole school year with no resolution?
I don't know if there's any real answer to that other than I think we've been looking at this absolutely ridiculous. I mean, when I was at the State Department of Ed and answering all these complaints, parents who desperately wanted the label, I would ask why? Why do you want that label on, well, we think it's a bullying situation. I said, but what does that get you? Because the label isn't what's important. What's important, if you really think about it, you want the behavior to stop and you want your child safe. And these repeated punitive consequences, whether it's detention or suspension or whatever, does nothing. But this is your best pathway toward having the behavior stop. And so, if that's what you really want, because you can't want revenge, so there is no statute of limitations. And I think, first of all the bullying laws are reactive. Nobody had a bullying law until after Columbine. And now every state does. And every state is changing them every year or two because it's not getting at the root cause. So we're doing something. We're the first in the nation to put this thing on its head. And administrators are, for the most part, thrilled because it now legislates for them to do what they've always wanted to do, which is to focus on creating safe climates for everyone.
Thank you, Joanne. Jay or Michelle?
Yeah, so just I wanted to add on with the discussion here, and really, time is something that keeps coming up, right? And so it's one, it does save you time in the long run because it actually comes to resolution, but it's also just some simple shifts. So we've had circles in our classrooms for quite some time now. It's how you started off the morning, and students would kind of share how they felt that day. And one just small tweak, right, that came out of the restorative practice training that we've been doing is including an important word, right? And that is the word because. And I was in one classroom, so it's the same amount of time, still the morning circle, but just by adding that word because, it's become such a deeper conversation and doing what's the most important, which is elevating student voice. So one example I have is one student said that they were feeling mad that morning because yesterday, I'll leave the kids' names out of it, someone didn't want to work with them. Okay, so now they included how they felt, why they felt that way, and then what that sparked off is other students coming in, like sharing, I felt that way before, because they get it, they get the feelings, but now they know the context, and saying, when someone didn't want to work with me, I just worked with somebody else. Or when someone didn't want to work with me, I asked them, okay, can you work with me tomorrow then? And so really just building it into the fabric of what we're doing. And we think about tiers, right? Like, 80% of students are in this tier, 20% of students are in this tier. Well, my math isn't correct. 15% it, and then 5% this. But really what restorative is about is the amount of time you're spending, right? So we get kind of stuck in this conversation of like, what are we going to do about these 5% of kids, and we got to label them bullies, and we got to punish them and kick them out, and obviously that doesn't work, and we've already addressed that earlier. But what's the most important piece is that we're spending the bulk of our time building a strong community, right? And so we have a strong community, a strong foundation. When things happen, like you think about a house, a window gets broken, you can repair that window because you have a strong house. And that really is what it's about. It's that student voice, that belonging. You have that structure that allows you to address these things that come up.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was great. Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, Jay, it's building empathy. It's teaching kids empathy. And I think that's the piece that, with all of our focus on reading, writing, math, we've lost that natural ability for kids to learn empathy through more unstructured time play, neighborhood play, more regular communication with each other rather than on devices. And so this is a more prescribed way to make sure that empathy is embedded into all of your conversations with peer to peer, with peer to adult, adult to adult. And I think that piece of empathy is both for the person who was harmed to understand that, there is empathy for the person who's causing harm, and for the person who's causing harm to understand how they're affecting the people around them.
Thank you, Kate. Maybe this is a good way to end by talking about resources for training. A really good question has to do with the policy requiring training, which I think is probably one of the most significant parts of this policy, frankly. But is there an approval list or approved list of providers? Who do we reach out to confirm if the training we are looking to provide meets the criteria of the required training? For example, around violence prevention beyond restorative training. So
I'll just say that there's no approved list per se, and there's no policing to make sure that everybody's done that training, whatever that training is. We provide training. We're not the only rodeo in town, but we're very proud of what we do. And we also, since both of us are in our fifth decade of education, we really do understand what schools and districts are about. And we've really tried to filter the restorative content through the lens of education. We do have trainings. We partner with the Connecticut Association of Schools. We partnered with Cooperative Education Services in Trumbull. We have those trainings listed on our website. But again, we're not the only ones. So again, we like to think we do a good job, but we're not it. And there's no requirement that says you have to go with us or anybody else, but we do provide that training. So
I think it's an important question, Joanne, because I just know that depending on the training or whatever training you choose may come with a certain perspective or may highlight certain things that weren't really designed to be highlighted, like around the challenging behavior form and things like that. So I do think that's a really good question, and I wish there were some kind of a clearinghouse where people could go to really ensure they were choosing the kind of training that provided you that it was in the spirit of the actual legislation. It's in the spirit of the policy, because some of this is what happens between the lines or the words, and your intent on implementing the policy. So you can really focus on a specific word, or you can focus on the intent of the policy, and training could really be geared in that direction depending on the intent of the trainer. Danielle.
Hi, I know Fran Amaro stepped off, but I do know that the training that they do for Ed Connect, Ed Advance, does satisfy the state requirement, whatever that looks like. I don't know, but if you reach out to him, he could probably help with that question.
Maybe Joanne, could you put his email address in the?
Yeah, I'll have to, I don't know if I have it right handy, but he's at Advance. Again, almost, I mean, all of the rests are doing it. We're doing it. There's a number of folks who are kind of private doing it. Their backgrounds are more out of, counseling or criminal justice. But I think you have to look it up and figure out what you need. Maybe Heather has something to say about that.
I think my recommendation is, regardless of which entity, and yes, there are many out there that can train your district, build internal capacity. If you don't build internal capacity within your district, you're not going to be able to sustain. There's too much teacher turnover. There's too many, new administrators coming in. So one of the best things I think Stratford ever did was we did go through Joanne and Pat, but they helped us build our internal capacity with their train the trainer model. And there's other agencies that also do a train the trainer model. So that's my recommendation, is that if you really want to get ahead of the training, start to make it a little bit internal. You'll still always need an outside entity, for different purposes, but for the main regurgitating and repurposing of this information, if you had some internal people, you'll be much better set up.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Daniel, you have your hand up?
Sorry, I never took it down.
Joanne and Pat, and any closing words? The one question I would love to ask you guys, with maybe 2 or 3 minutes, is you guys have been involved in this work for so many years, and I know I've known Joanne longer than you, Pat, but the conversation we had in June of 1999 is very different than the one we have now in October of 2025, and just kind of interested in your evolution and things that moved you along in your thinking around this work.
Well, I'll try to be brief. I think for me, my professional core has always been focusing on the school climate. In other words, building strong community and relationships. And in trying to achieve that, we got kind of sidelined for a while around the bullying statutes. And when I say that, 25 years worth of sidelining, because people wanted to know how to investigate bullying and what to do about it. But in all of the work that I've ever done around bullying, and I got asked to do a lot, I would always say the ultimate remedy for bullying is to create a climate that doesn't support that kind of behavior. And so Pat and I have never veered from that perspective. And when we brought, and again, Pat as a superintendent brought restorative practices to Connecticut way back again about 15 years ago, we never have seen a wider landscape that helps us achieve that primary goal, which is to create a positive climate. So that's kind of where we're at. And the beauty of this work is that it is not just for school, but I would have been a better parent 40 years ago. I would have been a better colleague, a better community member. These are skills for life. And so people who push back, and I think that's an important point for anybody who is listening, is that this is not one of those programs that you would never do at home. This is something that you can take with you wherever you go. And so I'll end with that.
Thank you, Joanne. Pat?
And I'll just throw into that mix all of the above, but for me, it's so important, especially in terms of school leadership, whether you're in a district or whether you're leading a district or whether you're leading a building, that this work must be modeled. And I think I learned very early on, as a brand spanking new superintendent, if I would have any hope at all of changing the trajectory and helping people to really help kids, I had to meet those adult needs as well, which meant I was modeling. So working restoratively is for everyone. And if you're on the journey, no doubt you're having success. You are a restorative practitioner with your own adults. You're working with them. Everybody needs to be heard. Everybody needs to have their story told. And then, so how are we gonna make it better? Was always my philosophy. And I think that's really what propelled this work through any district that I was working with. So I think everybody on here really needs to be willing to model the work in their own day-to-day practice.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Thank you. Before I turn this back over to Will Marie, I just want to thank all of you for contributing to improving our understanding of the school climate policy and the implementation work that's necessary, and sharing your successes and roadblocks and your work moving forward. So thank you so much for helping us all learn more about this work. And Will Marie?
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure working with all of you. We had a very good session, and we look forward to our next one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.